Welcome to the IBM CDO CTO Summit, the third in our six-part series for 2022. I'm Tim Humphrey, a leader in the IBM Chief Data Office, and I'm delighted to join you again to kick off today's session, Data Fabric, Delivering on Your Data Strategy. We have devices that have been generating data for ages, from punch cards and tabulating machines to notebooks and smartphones. Growth in data, sprawl and volume, diverse ecosystems, and varied existing management systems lead to enterprise data going unused. And if in the past, your data nerds used to just be data scientists and business analysts, now everyone needs access to consumable data and useful insights. There are many who are recognizing that they need data, but the data is siloed. We need better ways to find, manage, and leverage data. We need better methods for democratizing data, and we all struggle with whether or not to centralize data. In today's session, we will explore how new concepts such as data fabric provide the architecture businesses need to become intelligently automated, predictive, and ultimately data-driven. We will hear from Ram Venkatesh, Chief Technology Officer at Cloudera, and my boss, Inderpal Bhandari, IBM's Global Chief Data Officer, as well as a panel of data leaders, or what we like to call change agents, who will share their experiences with Data Fabric. And before we start our discussion today, I have a surprise for you. Our newly released The Data Differentiator Guide, where you'll find a data strategy approach that's been continually tested and optimized by IBM experts during client engagements. Now, for the first time, we're making it publicly available to all data leaders. Questions we'll answer include, how do I go about creating a data strategy? What are the steps to getting buy-in and showing success? What is the right data architecture that will help me deliver on my strategy? I am sure you will find it very insightful. Thank you again for joining, and let's get started.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Timothy, and welcome back everyone to the IBM CDO CTO Summit Series. This is our third consecutive year bringing you these programs online. And today we're really excited to bring this episode 3 to you on Data Fabric, Delivering on Your Data Strategy, featuring data leaders who will share their experience and thoughts, which we hope you can apply in your situation. I'm David Matheson, the founder and CEO of the CDO Club and CDO Summit, and I'm delighted to welcome back to the program IBM's Global Chief Data Officer, Inderpal Bhandari, and to our special guest today, Ram Venkatesh, the Chief Technology Officer at Cloudera. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. Ram, first question for you. Data leaders today are dealing with increasing complexity as organizations take on hybrid multi-cloud data environments. What are some of the new concepts and solutions that you're hearing about?
The underlying narrative here, right, to start with, this is a period of massive data growth. Right? The pandemic has it's accelerated enterprises' adoption for an appetite for SaaS, for public cloud technologies. It's a period of tremendous opportunity, I think, in our industry from a data management standpoint. But along with this, right, our customers are experiencing some challenges. For example, a few of them would be, there is a siloed mindset between different lines of business and how they work with their data. There is the shadow IT, where there's a tension between centralized administration and local control that people want, uncontrolled data sprawl, resulting from having an on-prem estate and having multiple public cloud estates. All of this is complexity, and this is, I think, really leading to deep introspection, both on the technology side as well as what you do on the org front when it comes to data management. And I think, in this backdrop, hybrid and multi-cloud data estates, they're really an operating reality for many of our customers, more than 80% of our customers, actually. And we see that the R word, repatriation, it's also making its appearance for a number of reasons, right? Regulatory compliance being one of them. Especially if you think about in EMEA and APAC, this is more of a concern than in the US. So moving the right workload to the right place at the right time, I think that's one of the key things that our customers are looking for solutions on. And I think this is where having consistent, flexible data management with the data fabric is a solution that they are looking for to address this problem.
Thank you for setting that foundation. I know our community would love to know a little bit more about data fabric. How does data fabric fit into the landscape of modern data architecture, such as fabrics, lake houses, and data meshes?
This is the perennial debate between centralized data management that lakes and lake houses enable, and sort of the decentralized agile approaches that technologies like data mesh, for example, are promoting. So data fabric, I see it enables this consistent, non-intrusive data management while promising central visibility. So it's kind of like, it lets you have your cake and eat it too. It helps our customers sort of think about data sets as a fundamental organizing principle. It's about the data, not so much about the platform that's used to manage the data. So these data sets, as they think of them as these first-class things, they are things that they want them to be portable between all these different data estates that they have. They want security and authorization and governance and provenance to kind of flow with the data set, regardless of wherever it is. And they want global discovery, global governance, so that they can see what's happening in real time. But so if you contrast this with, say, data mesh is actually something that I think we're going to hear a lot over the next decade. It's kind of like microservices for data, right? It's about agile teams that can build and deploy data applications in a much more autonomous and scalable way. So I see that there's a lot of synergy, and it's complementary. A data fabric-based way of doing data management sets you up really nicely for you to adopt data mesh as a socio-technological construct.
Interpol, on that note, given that IBM is such a large enterprise, I'm wondering if you could share your experience with data fabric at IBM.
When I arrived at IBM, one of the first things we did was set up a data strategy. And our data strategy is really to enable the business strategy. And it basically was around making IBM into an AI enterprise. But it wasn't clear what AI means for an enterprise. So why not let's do it ourselves? Then we can use that as a showcase for our clients and customers. We did that. We did that over a couple of years. We went after all the data. We realized that AI for an enterprise meant that you had to infuse AI into all the major business processes like supply chain, procurement, quote to cash, etc. And then you got major reductions in cycle time. So we kind of understood that. But think about that right now, all these major processes are pretty distributed across the enterprise, as is the data. As we were going through this, in fact, GDPR, European Union GDPR, that regulation hit. And we started focusing very much on making sure that IBM was ready for that. We realized that to do that, it was going to be a massive lift because it was also going to involve our suppliers, not just us. To be completely candid, we got all that done manually for the most part. But those were phenomenal lessons that we'd learned because now we could think about how to automate this. While creating the AI enterprise, we'd kind of learned we have to go off and infuse AI into all the major processes. To do successful AI, you had to ready the data, otherwise it was garbage in, garbage out. You actually could apply AI to ready the data. So for things like finding metadata or descriptors for the data, business descriptions and all that, you could use AI to do that. And we then took that lens to that problem because otherwise this problem is very hard, right? So to find all the metadata across a massive enterprise, many large data sets, to do all that manually is very difficult. So we kind of had figured out that was a counterintuitive finding that we had. Then we run into EU GDPR. We know we've got to automate everything. Also, fundamentally, it also gave us an idea that in many cases, we have to let the data lie where it stays. It's like a golf game. You have to play it where it lies. They won't allow you to move it to some other country. You've got to essentially treat it as those regulations demand. When you start putting all that together, you kind of recognize that, okay, so we are going to have a pretty distributed environment. We can't always move the data. We've got to be able to do things consistently. There too, there's a subtle point. What you can do in Singapore, you need not do in Germany, right? So it's consistently, but within regulation, but it's got to be, the governance has to be multimodal. When we started thinking about the phenomenal complexity all this would entail, we recognized that we needed a different architecture. And the architecture, we kind of call it data fabric. But fundamentally, you can think about it as having some major components. The next level in the evolution of metadata, that's kind of an augmented knowledge graph that tells you, what the data is, where it lies, what it's about, the business terminology, who shall have access to it, et cetera, et cetera. Once you have that, you're now in a position to intelligently automate, because without having that, you can't really do any automation, because the automation relies heavily on the metadata. So then you need basically a component for intelligent automation. Then you need a self-service component, because otherwise, if you're going to centralize the servicing of the consumption of the data, it's going to become very difficult, because the data is all over the place. You've got users all over the place. So you kind of need a self-service marketplace type of vision to be able to pull that off. And that's where the comments Ram was making on data mesh, all that stuff comes in. So I kind of almost see it as a necessary data mesh, as a necessary component of everything you need to do for the data fabric. And so you've got to put these 4 or 5 components together to stitch together a data fabric so that it becomes easy to use, the central pane of glass in terms of visibility, but you're able to then do things in a distributed fashion as well as in a centralized fashion. Again, one of those things early in the game, do we have it perfect? No. Will we get it perfect eventually? Yes. And we're pretty transparent about essentially our experience with it.
What's one piece of advice or some advice that you would give to data leaders who are setting their data strategy and building their architecture for the first time with an eye towards, towards fabric and mesh?
Look, I think the best place to start is pick a concrete new use case that provides demonstrable business value and that can be achieved in a reasonable time frame. And for that, today I would say that's got to be 6 months or substantially less than 6 months. So if you make that single use case work, just like he was describing it, right, and build on it, then that becomes a rocket ship to kind of showcase what's the value that this way of thinking about data and data as a product can do for your business. That sort of targeted time to value for a single use case approach is much more palatable today than like a multi-year science project. So it's like the focus is on use cases, on customer value, on self-service, on consumption. That's sort of the place you're driving from, rather than trying to build out the most perfect architecture, right? And today's business users, their expectations is that the platform basically evaporates away and it shows up as a set of consistent policy guidelines, right? Especially for the chief data officers, right? 2 elements I think are critical in this journey. One is risk and the other is cost governance. To make sure that you're being very judicious about risk and privacy and how you actually handle the data. And also from a cost standpoint, regardless of where the data is, in some cases on-prem, you have the problem of making sure that you're getting the most out of the capacity that you have, right? So you have the problem of scarcity. And then in the public cloud, you have the problems of plenty, right? So you want to make sure that you're managing your budgets so you don't spend your annual budget in a month through a cost overrun in a data project. You have to contextualize that in the fabric with where the data is. Architectures, they exist to support the data strategy, but the data strategy itself, they have being really focused around business value and a business use case. I think that's a great starting point. And if you start from there, the rest of the pieces of the puzzle kind of fall in place.
From a data fabric standpoint, it is very interesting, just as a profession, where I think it's taking the profession. Chief data officers, they're focused on risk mitigation or top line growth or enhancing the bottom line, right? It's one of those 3, there's some mix that usually they're focused on. I think what the data fabric is going to do, it's going to really bring all 3 together. It will really emphasize the ability of the CDO to be quite facile across all 3 at the same time, because that's really what you're trying to set up with the data fabric. You're trying to make sure everything is done appropriately. You're trying to enable the business, and it's all happening in a way that you're able to do it all at the same time, because you're kind of envisioning it that way. I think as this takes hold, they will have to have that facility to go across all 3 rapidly. They have to get to empowered teams and be very comfortable operating in that kind of model and know how to do that. As Tim Humphrey mentioned earlier, we did introduce the data differentiator guide, and it is going to be a living document because we do recognize that this is all going to evolve. but we think it's going to be very helpful.
Fantastic session, gentlemen. Thank you so much for your time today, for sharing your thoughts with our community. And now we're going to explore this topic more deeply with our panel of experts. I'm thrilled to moderate this panel on data fabric, delivering on your data strategy. And I'm just delighted to welcome to the program Mark Clare, who's former enterprise head of data strategy and enablement at Cigna Evernorth, Sham Kashkar, who's global head of analytics and data management at Meta Facebook, Akshay Krishnaswamy, who's chief architect and commercial lead at Palantir Technologies, and finally Priya Krishnan, who's director of product management, data governance, data privacy, and data science at IBM. Welcome to the program, everyone. What do you believe it takes to craft a thoughtful and impactful data strategy that really drives business results?
Well, I've always felt the data strategy should be a balance, kind of a top-down business strategy, business outcome-based approach with a bottom-up data foundation. And by data foundation, I'm talking data governance, ownership, stewardship, data quality management, security, privacy, the core components that allow you to have a sustainable foundation for reuse. But if you don't start with understanding the business drivers of an organization and the business outcomes, and then how to measure those business outcomes, I think your strategy always falls short.
Sean, same question.
Yeah, in fact, as Mark very well said, that it is about business value, right? And I would say, some of the key elements of the data strategy is business value creation, the data culture or organizational readiness, and of course, the system landscape governance and technologies that definitely comes in place. To make really data strategy successful, some of the key things that we need to really have in the mind right in the beginning, it should be relevant, it should be integrated, and it should be consumable. If you want to really drive the data-driven culture, data democratization is a very common buzzword. Everybody talks about that. I will also add to that, building the community or knowledge graph, meaning, bringing all the product views community together where they can share their own experiences and need, as well as, they are connected through the, insight and analytics. What it drives is the connectedness of the value of the data. As we talk about the scale later, it is not anymore enough to have data strategy which provides insight in dashboards, reports. It should be truly integrated in the business processes, in the context of the business. It should be available right at the time when business need and to drive it.
Great point, Sean. Akshay, over at Palantir, anything you'd like to add?
I think those are both great answers. And I think really get to the heart of how we think about it too. I think it is sort of a twofold approach where there has to be both this deductive element, where this kind of strategy that's sort of born of the business and the kind of the operational needs, kind of kept honest by the inductive method, right? So how are you actually doing things organically, actually testing things in tight feedback loops that tie up to that overarching strategy, but might work at, faster pace or sort of more federated in approach. But there has to be that tie up, I think, as Sean mentioned as well. And I think the instrumentation of the feedback loops between the different stakeholders of different types is also key, right? So I think a lot of things that we think about internally and also with our customers and partners is how do we make those software-defined feedback loops where possible, kept honest by, human governance and human accountability. So trying to, if you think about the types of folks that are historically consuming data strategy or participating, can we elevate them to being, not just sort of read-only participants, but read-write participants in the process as well? It is a key part of that, I think. And I think echoes a lot of what folks just said, I think, in that vein too.
So if I have to sum it up on what makes a great data strategy, right, it definitely is the cultural buy-in. So you need to have the right stakeholders to buy in. But every time you are able to take them on the journey of the pain point, like the businesses are growing, your workloads are growing, but the minute you are able to connect a stakeholder to the pain point that they're feeling, I think that's when the aha moment hits in terms of, oh yeah, this is why I need this. Otherwise, the usual question that people ask is, well, I have a data strategy. Why are you telling me I don't have a data strategy? Oh, well, you do, but have you considered this real pain as your business is growing? And that connection in their mind sort of gets them thinking about, okay, an enterprise data strategy really makes sense for me.
Now we've got a strategy, but why is it critical to have that strategy in place before we start addressing the technology architecture?
We can be academic for a minute. Requirements, business requirements, data requirements should drive architecture, which then drives technology choices. But, I've seen too many examples of big data investments, particularly in the last decade under the skies of big data, big investments with limited value. And, I always balance requirements to me include time, they include investment cost, they include obviously the business outcome cases you're trying to deliver, and any risk and regulatory dimensions you need to measure or need to address. And it's getting that up front, well defined, so that then the architecture is designed not to deliver something in 5 years, but to deliver something if it's 90 days for the value outcome you want, or if it's 1 year for the outcome, it's designed to actually deliver at that appropriate time and the investment level.
How about you, Shyam? Why is it critical to have a data strategy in place?
Kind of, as Mark very well said, that it is getting the right requirement upfront is very, very critical. I would just extend that point to say that if you want to make the data strategy, align with the business imperatives, that is where it is important to have the strategy upfront defined. Not only the technology sequencing aspect of it. Another key aspect, in my view, is really the engagement with the stakeholder.
Yeah.
If the strategy is not relevant or really solving the business challenges or needs they have, they would lose the engagement very quickly. So that is also a core aspect of having that strategy front is very, very helpful and critical.
Akshay, anything you'd like to add?
I think about it sort of like in the declarative paradigm, sort of from a procedural perspective, right? It's like, if you don't have a mission objective, it's hard to rally the right resources around that. You can't really qualify the opportunities, or to Shyam's great point, like keep people motivated or keep them sort of understanding why it's important to pursue these particular implementations. And I think, to echo what Mark said as well, there's a lot of interesting technologies and bits and bytes out there. And weaving them together can sometimes, perhaps like in many cases, be worth the cost of integration, be worth the cost of doing something de novo new. But oftentimes it's important to decouple that from the actual strategic objectives, because you don't want to get too locked into the exoticism of one technical approach just for the sake of doing it, independent of the actual objectives from both a data and a business perspective jointly. And so I think it's an accountability mechanism as much as it is kind of a delivery mechanism.
Priya, given your position at IBM, you're in a unique role where you could see the sort of global landscape of what other companies are doing. What are the challenges and possibilities that you're seeing out there for the data landscape?
I would categorize the challenges in 3 different headers, if you will, right? I heard somebody use this and I love it. Everybody wants to be a data nerd today, right? So in the past, that wasn't really the case, right? If you needed access to data, you would go and get your IT personnel. You would wait for that. And only a few people had access to data. But today, everybody and every unit in your organization wants access to data, and they all want to be a data nerd. And they don't want to have to wait for this or go through a lengthy manual process, right? I want the data when I need it and turn it into great outcomes for my applications. So that's the first trend, if you will, that we're seeing. The second thing is that because of this need to have the data in the hands of everybody driving business decisions very quickly, there's been more duplication of data. To serve this need very quickly, the easiest solution was to just duplicate the data, and this has created a lot of data silos. And with these data silos are also localized privacy and regulations that are coming from outside have also been applied within silos throughout the enterprise. Finally, new workloads are expanding like crazy, but they're not just expanding in your traditional setup. They are going across a number of different clouds. Data is distributed everywhere, but the need for the access to that data anytime with privacy is growing day by day.
I do love that point about data nerds. You're right. Back to Mark. But now that we're seeing, some of the sort of this landscape, and that we're heading towards that path of making this data available to all without having to worry about their usage of it, what's the value of scaling a data strategy approach beyond the traditional or the standard use of traditional analytics, for example, to include data science or operations, digital, Internet of Things, and even artificial intelligence?
A decade ago, we thought in terms of analytic patterns and then the necessary governance for the transaction side to make sure our data was governed, protected, and of quality actually to run analytics. But what we've seen really in the growth, particularly in corporate Fortune 500 in the last decade, the growth of digital, the growth of use of devices like this, the growth of IoT, that means that my architecture patterns and my governance and data management leadership has to extend to the edge. Whether it's a smart sensor or smart device or browser, it has to extend more into the stream where we might have executed rules a decade ago. Now we're executing algorithms. So our approach has to be even more holistic. I heard an acronym the other day. We used to call it OLAP for online analytic processing, OLTP, and it was HTAP, hybrid transaction analytic processing. Because in a digital world, we don't have time to always separate out into these two kind of analytic and transaction patterns. We really have to do a hybrid because the response has to sometimes be instantaneous. Right. So I think that overall we have a more holistic approach now, and that's going to drive, I would say, immediate need to connect data versus go out and build a new data store, build a warehouse, build a lake. And it's that connectivity as we start talking about data fabric, which is critical.
Fantastic. Shyam, anything you'd like to add to that about scaling the traditional approach to a data strategy?
Without the scale in place, we are really going to limit the value of the insight, from the business perspective. And that's where it is very important when we talk about ML or AI or having those algorithms providing insight is not enough anymore. It should be really integrated with the business. It should be accessible. It should be consumable in the context of the business process. So that's where with the innovative use of workflows and how the information is connected across and enabling the really frontline subject matter expert with the power of insight. And when I say power of insight, I'm not talking about dashboard, report, or metrics. They should be able to derive the advanced analysis, anomaly detection, correlation, patterns, apply statistical methodologies on the fly without having any technology background. And that's where you really empower the frontline subject matter expert to drive the business outcome. Be it your customer engagement, it could be a salesperson talking to their accounts in the context of territory or whatever the book of business they are working with. So all the insights should be consumable right when they need it, and it should be accessible in a scalable manner. Without that, you are really going to limit the value of the data.
Akshay, any additional comments?
Just to pile onto these great answers here, I think this is really the so what of all of this, I think, right? So you can connect data into the, sort of modernize the data approach, modernize the analytics approach, but if it isn't touching, if it's stopping at the water's edge and doesn't go into operational domains, that really is leaving most of the value on the table. And I think what we see across our partners, was on the government side, the industrial side, kind of wherever else, it's like, you need to have these, it's not insights, it's actions, I think, to Shyam's point, right? It's like being able to actually weave these specific primitives, these outputs into business processes and actually allow people to build the right feedback loops with that intelligence they build to ensure that asset is not just there, consolidated, clean, but actually relevant and dynamic based on end user usage. I think, and that oftentimes now involves like being able to weave together the digital primitives that are coming from the edge, IoT devices, AI-driven processes. Ultimately, it's about actually, I think, pushing that intelligence. We think about connecting it from analytics into operations, right? And if there is no right-hand side of that equation, ultimately, we think the ongoing cost or cost-benefit analysis of doing this modernization work is going to fade pretty quickly.
In your experience, what are some key tips in getting key stakeholders on board?
This is a very critical topic beyond the technology, beyond everything else. This is important, right? To be able to, like I mentioned, and a few others have also mentioned here, right? You must have the right stakeholders in place. They must see the problem and they must see the pain point to be able to come on the journey with us, right? That's really, really, really critical. So you need to have the right stakeholders. You need to be able to show them the pain point and the business outcomes that they will derive in solving that pain point, right? The other things that have worked is that if you are getting the buy-in, don't go in with the perspective of changing everything that's already available. You need to start to coexist before disruptions, right? If at all. If you're able to get buy-in from a stakeholder to talk about how you're going to improve what is already existing in their ecosystem, I think that would go a long way in getting their buy-in, right? The second thing is also pick something smaller that can be implemented quickly and derive a success and derive some business benefits. Define a smaller success criteria and start small before you're able to start expanding. Because let's just admit it, right? Enterprise data strategies are a long-term journey, right? But if you're able to get the right stakeholders, show that you can coexist in their ecosystem and define success criteria that's really small, a small use case that you're able to show value, we've seen that that goes a long way in being able to get adoption throughout the enterprise.
We've set the groundwork here. Let's dig into data fabric now. So what is a data fabric? What is the unique value? And how is it different from other solutions that we see everywhere, like a data mesh or legacy data stores or data lake houses?
Well, let me throw out a term many to many and then explain what I mean by that. Particularly over the last 10 years, 10 to 15 years, and I've worked as a data leader in multiple industries. 10 to 15 years ago, our ecosystems were very small, typically one or two technologies, mostly internal. Today, in almost any industry, particularly in certain ones, your ecosystem is so heterogeneous now with so many different technologies, often more data external that you don't really have governance over and control over versus internal. So with such a complex and growingly complex heterogeneous ecosystem, as I think Priya, you said, coexistence. So how do we coexist with all the legacy, but focus on delivering business value and outcomes quickly? And to me, the many is many different types of sources of data, but many different types of outputs or data products that we have to deliver. And then to be able to manage and govern all of that. And to me, the data fabric is really that connectivity of the many to many, and then doing it in a way you can govern and expand it. And you can also control your long-term strategy in terms of the sources and some of your legacy technologies that could be consolidated, but with the view that you want to deliver data products on the output side.
I think, come on, some of the key aspects where the data fabrics is really becoming, mandate now, as Mark earlier mentioned. I think he was ahead of the world when he talked about data fabrics a decade ago. But with that said, the complexity and the volume and the agility, that is needed to respond to address the business challenges. That's where data fabrics comes into place. And I would say data fabrics is still, is evolving, like data lake, a decade and a half ago. Depending on who you talk to, and it's going to evolve in my view over next few years. But it's the kind of design or architecture principle or concept that you really leverage to optimize the value of the data, which includes integration, governance, metadata, and cataloging. So in fact, I would say, the metadata has been in use for a while now. So it's not on news anymore. And people really make use of the metadata to drive the business value and make the data relevant and consumable. But with that said, in today's world, the complexity, that we are facing, and is going to grow exponentially. And that's where scale comes to the data ecosystem. And what I mean by that is that when we say ML model, AI ML model, and deriving the insight. So we can use the same analogy to really improve the landscape of the data in all aspects of the data, integration, APIs, bringing all the things together to make the insight relevant to the business, at the scale needed by today's complexity.
And I think the key word in my mind is what Mark touched on, which is heterogeneity. It is this point that I think if you look at a lot of existing technologies you mentioned, and not to cast aspersions at any of them, right? But a lot of these approaches, if not explicitly, implicitly, are dictating architecture, right? Around the data, around the modality of compute, around something that is actually quite instrumental to how the work is done. And I think what's exciting about the data fabric is this acknowledgement that, I think to Mark's point, it's the inputs, it's the outputs that could be different, it's the compute modalities, it's the forms of active metadata. You have to have a shared governance envelope and a way of doing things that's enforced across the fabric, but you're going to have to acknowledge that, especially in domains that are multimodal, right? Where you think, in manufacturing use cases, logistics use cases, there's going to be different technologies used along similar patterns. And I think that is where I've seen the power of the fabric really come to life, is this acknowledgement that we're not trying to shoehorn in a specific type of technical approach for every single stakeholder. To Priya's point, that cooperation is so important, and people have to be able to see that they can bring existing, technology engines or different types of sub approaches that actually harmonize across like a shared enterprise approach. And I think, from a technical perspective, it's like you are thinking at the term of abstractions that I think can actually be implemented at scale, to Shyam's point.
How can a data fabric strengthen compliance, or can data fabric help strengthen compliance?
Shyam, Akshay, and Mark, they all touched on this heterogeneous nature, but Shyam also mentioned this aspect of actively being able to produce this and at scale, right? So that's also very important, I think, in terms of a data fabric landscape, if you will. To me, one more addition on top of this that is unique to data fabric is being able to centrally apply governance and policies, but giving decentralized access, right? I think that's the uniqueness there that comes out of it, so that you are always compliant and you are always up to speed and proactive on regulations, right? You asked about the strengthening the compliance. If you actually think about what happens today, or maybe in the past, compliance was generally an afterthought. It was taken care of through audits. It's an after the fact operation. That is something that we really, I think Data Fabric solves and avoids that, right? With Data Fabric, with all the automation of the authoring and the enforcement of the policies centrally, regardless of how the data moves through the system. And that's key because it's such a heterogeneous environment and not everybody wants to move data through the system all the time. Some of them want virtualized access to data, but regardless of how the data moves through the system or doesn't move through the system, the insurance on proactive compliance that is always up to date is critical. And this also helps us tie it to the broader external compliance organization. So if you're able to have a landscape where you're centrally able to manage all compliance and policies, and as the change happens, you are proactively up to speed, can you think about how effective that is in being able to really keep regulations in place, right? Change management becomes easier to track and manage throughout the life cycle of the data asset. So to me, that particular being able to centrally manage this and strengthen compliance proactively, not as an after the fact, is critical when we talk about Data Fabric.
Let's start with Mark, some examples of Data Fabric in action and maybe touch on some of the powerful results it can deliver.
One of the big changes today, the technology is really caught up with the vision of what a data fabric is, as well as the ecosystems and the complexity ecosystems are demanding more agility and more extensibility than we had years ago. But imagine coming in to the office to do your job or working virtually, as many of us do today, and pulling up a dashboard and selecting the type of process you need to do. You select your data in business terms and the terminology you use. You select your role in the organization, or maybe you're matched against a role based, maybe you're a data scientist, or maybe you're just a business analyst. You're possibly selecting the level of security and data protection you need, or have that imposed through policy, as Priya mentioned. And then the next day, you've got a virtual platform on your desktop, virtual physical platform, and you've also selected time. Is this an activity you're going to be doing for the next week, for the next month, for the next 6 months, and what type of regulatory or audit practices have to be done to archive what you've done? That real self-service example I saw in late 2012 in a financial institution, and that led me to see the vision of what a self-service data fabric platform could do. Now, the technology at that time, it was investment and time intensive to build. We have much more automation, as Priya mentioned today. And I think our focus has shifted much more to the business outcomes of a fabric. But that type of empowered self-service, I think, is what almost every business user I talk to today, business stakeholder I talk to today, wants in some shape or form.
The use cases remain largely the same. It is how is the differentiator, with the data fabrics. And Priya talked about the governance, which is very important. And getting governance in place is always a tricky proposition. And I think data fabrics also can automate the governance aspect of it. And the governance could be it can be in a self-driving mode. It can learn and it can improve on its own. So that's some of the thing. But to me, it is the scale that data fabrics brings in terms of the insight, and really optimize all aspects of the data engineering, be it a pipeline, be it insight generation, be it data democratization. Some of the other benefits people may not talk about, but it really improves the happiness quotient of employees. Yes. What I mean by that is, struggle to deliver, insight, or the amount of efforts you need to put in. Bringing that edge to that process, definitely improves the happiness quotient of the employee, and that has a large implication in terms of organizational effectiveness.
I've seen a lot of really interesting work, very powerful work in, for instance, energy and in utilities, where I think you're seeing the approach around they have to embrace heterogeneity because it's been the reality forever in those domains. It's also very impactful, very interesting, different types of data-rich domains there, where you see work, in domains like electric ops, working atop the same data fabric principles as work in finance or work in logistics or work in sourcing. Very different workflows, very different data types, very different compute modalities, but they're all working atop shared proactive governance principles, to Priya's point, and actually able to do workflows that otherwise would look very distinct in a way that's actually governed in kind of a shared way. So having seen those domains, I think with a lot of like the operational accountability, kind of forcing the feedback loops and the structure there, really build out their fabrics in a very kind of operational way has been very exciting. One public example that I can cite here is Airbus, in terms of their work internally to build a data fabric, has done a lot of amazing things across quality, design, manufacturing, and other core realms. What was really cool about the way they set that up, again, which they've talked about publicly, it's now they've evolved their data fabric, I think, to a point that Mark alluded to, into an ecosystem where now they are actually using, they've branded it Skywise, and they have over 150 plus partner airlines all securely contributing to this shared knowledge asset and operational asset on a shared foundation. And that would have been possible if they had not sort of embraced a model that actually could scale outside their four walls at some point.
Priya, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I love the happiness quotient that Shyam brought up, right? I think one of the examples that we found with one of our clients was they are operating in multiple geographies, right? So there is a unit in Turkey, and then there is one in India. Now, their data scientists are wanting to run models for a cross-geography analysis. But because they could not share the data, it wasn't silos, they did not have the central governance, they did not have the data fabric. The solution for them was, you only get to see your data, you only get to see your data. Kind of imagine and simulate your data and do your models, right? That's most frustrating thing for a data scientist to be asked to do that, right? But with the implementation of data fabric, that was the first problem that they solved. They were able to give the data to the data scientist with the right governance and privacy rules in place. So now they felt like, okay, fine, I'm really running a cross organization initiative. A data scientist gets really happy about it because they get enough data to run their models. It is not simulated, it is the right data, and they don't have to worry about being in data jail at all, right? So this was a real example of where the happiness quotient, right? And I used to be a former data scientist, so I can imagine, I can put myself in that place to feel like, oh, finally, I do have access to do what I really need to do.
Just to wrap up, wonder if any of you have any closing thoughts or maybe any gotchas that we need to avoid?
You know, as you build a fabric, I mean, we hit on the necessary need for a feedback loop, so that not only we're generating insights from the outputs of a fabric, but we're driving actions and we're measuring those actions, and that's a feedback loop that continues to mature your process. And that can only be done if you have the right business stakeholders within your governance, and your stakeholders are actively involved, so they're actually learning from the actions, and that feedback just continues to mature the data process. That shifts the data fabric from just focusing on infrastructure and sourcing data to provide outputs, but it actually gets to a data fabric as a value enabler versus just a value investment.
Just sort of reflecting on the conversation so far, I think it reflects the lessons, at least I think we've learned at Palantir, which is how to think about balancing the need for speed and agility with proper governance and being able to ensure that you're instrumenting success correctly along the way. So there's probably, the danger of premature optimization along either dimension, right? Where you could think about, being too agile, too fast, not actually setting up the right empirical criteria to understand, is this actually working or not, versus like, hey, we've really overfit the amount of criteria and we're just not focused enough on executing for the business or for the core process. And so I think finding that balance is always an iterative function. That's key. And I think there's probably no simple way to avoid it or to hit it, but I think it's just people's willingness to understand it's going to be a process.
So data fabric is not like a one solution fits all. Going overboard with the solution may not be the right thing for every use case. You have to really understand your environment, the complexity. And by the way, complexity doesn't mean that if you have a large volume of the data, it doesn't necessarily mean the data fabric is the right solution there. It is the combination of multiple factors. So for example, if you want to really automate the continuous improvement on your metadata and active metadata, what happens to data, what is happening with the data, we have good things technically and theoretically, but doesn't necessarily mean they are relevant to the business. So relevance to the business should be the core foundation when you're trying to solve the problem. And that's where you don't have to pick all the aspects of the data fabric. You may have an ability to pick and choose what is most relevant to your business problem.
It is a journey, right? Data fabric is not one technology or exactly a prescribed solution, right? I think, Sham, you did mention this at some point as well. It is flexible. It is a journey. The key is to make sure that you have an open mind when you think about a data fabric and you move along the journey. And as you design it, I think one of the gotchas to keep in mind is, again, like I said, don't boil the ocean right at the beginning. Start with something small and tangible, but also think about how your business and how your workloads are going to grow for the future, right? Don't design something just for today, right? And it is a journey. It will evolve. So the good thing about data fabric is that it's flexible enough and adaptive to different styles. So whatever is important for you, design it for what makes sense. You are different from everybody else, right? So make that unique and make that your unique journey is what I would say.
That's a wrap. What a great session. I learned so much from you all today. I know this is going to benefit our community. My sincere thanks to each of you for joining us and sharing your perspectives on this important and timely topic. And now we're going to move on to the live Q&A with our audience, which starts right now. All right, what a great session. I want to thank everybody in chat and in the comments. Great comments, great questions. We did get a few questions in the Q&A as well. I want to thank Ram and Akshay and Mark and Priya and Sham, who can't make it. Apologies for that. And I think Ram is actually in Europe. So thanks. I think it's like 6 p.m. there. So thanks everybody for coming back. Sure. What a fantastic session. We're going to take questions from the audience. Please feel free to post more questions in chat. And our team will also put another link to IBM's data differentiator guide, which was released today. And Srinivasan, it was mentioned, and it's great to hear that and see your comments in the chat as well. So without further ado, let's start with Akshay. We do have some questions from the audience. We're going to get to those, but we did have a question from Nicole Bouchon, who asked a question on the registration form. She's director over at 3XA. She wants to know, in retrospect, Akshay, was there anything you wish you'd done differently when it came to your data fabric implementation?
That's a great question. And thanks again for hosting this all, David and team. I think just reflecting a bit on what we talked about during the session, we probably biased a bit towards over designing a bit of the fabric implementation up front. I'd say as we were early in that journey here at Palantir. And I think, I think what we learned was, what the right balance was between, central governance and federated governance. I think there were certainly aspects of that central process that we set up that ended up being still very useful to iterate on in a more federated manner over time. But I think, in retrospect, hindsight's 2020, we probably would have allowed for a bit more free-form exploration within the global constraints with some of those first pilot teams working atop the fabric, as opposed to trying to sort of distill some of those sub-criteria in detail that really would emerge later out of the learnings in the field or with the teams kind of locally. So just a balancing act, but maybe we could have been a little bit more federated to begin with.
Interesting. Yeah, this is definitely a federated model. And as Priya said, they're going to be unique to every situation. So for all of you out there, this is unique to you. And I'm going to send the next one to Mark, because for many of you know, he's at Evernorth Cigna, but before that, he was at JPMorgan Chase. He's implemented data fabric a decade ago. It's not new technology. He was at the cutting edge, the bleeding edge. He's seen a lot of implementation. So we had similar question from both Jason Fedorov, who's over at IBM, and Forrest Mars at 8451. And they wanted to know, what's the difference between data mesh and data fabric, and why would you choose one over the other? And I know if you re-listen to this replay, Ram at Cloudera did mention, that it's more data mesh is more like microservices for data, agile teams that can deploy data ops in a much more autonomous and scalable way. But Mark, just wondered if you wanted to dig deeper on that and answer Forrest and Jason's question.
Well, I think, first of all, we have to understand there's a lot of definitions floating around right now with these terms are relatively new, at least to a broad audience. This is no different than I remember the first Master Data Management Conference about 15 plus years ago, in which myself and every other speaker started with 1 or 2 definitional pages because we all had different definitions of MDM at that time. So let's recognize that these are kind of still emerging. So I'm going to kind of stick with my definitions, which align to Gardner and others. Is I think you need both. For me, a data mesh is that specific solution architecture of building business-driven data products. And those should be fairly technology agnostic. I can use a lot of different technologies or in combination to deliver business data products. Where, as I said earlier, the fabric to me is that many-to-many connectivity. It doesn't replace a lake, it doesn't replace a warehouse, but when I need that connectivity across a broad ecosystem of many different sources, and I think one of the advantages of that is that we live in a multi-cloud world now, where I'm on-prem and in multi-clouds, and the time it takes to consolidate that data to a lake, it is sometimes prohibitive to the business. Or you need that time, but you also need to be delivering business value along the way. So having that kind of many-to-many infrastructure in place of a fabric, I think is advantageous regardless of the rest of your data architecture and the rest of your data strategy. I think it's just a core dimension. And I think Interpol, I wrote down when you were talking, I think there's some key dimensions of a fabric. The self-service is critical. The intelligent automation was a second dimension Interpol touched on. Enterprise metadata driven. I mean, this is one of the big differences. Building a fabric a decade ago with where metadata products were and metadata technology and machine learning was difficult. Now we have a little more technology advantage of building them, but also a fabric still has to be business driven. So it has to have those mesh business products as outputs. If not, this is just an infrastructure investment.
Got it. Great. And Forrest, I did see in your comments, you understand the difference. You just wanted to see when would you choose one over the other. So yeah. Thanks so much, Mark. Next question for Ram. Ram, we had a question from Tim Dalton. And Tim is Director QA Compliance over at Command Digital. And he asked, starting from a fragmented environment, what are some early steps he can take to better understand his situation and make better long-term plans for a data fabric?
It's a good question. First off, thanks for having me on the panel and the program. I think it's very enjoyable for us as well to be participating in this conversation. I think that when you think about fragmentation, you kind of have to decide whether it's at the data level or at the infrastructure level, right? If the fragmentation is from a data management standpoint, as you have, and for many of our customers this is the case, you have disparate data sources all over the place, multi-cloud, some on-prem and so on, then I think really thinking about the nice thing about a fabric-centric strategy is that it imposes consistency on the fragmentation. It's like we are acknowledging that we live in this plural world where there are multiple data estates, but some things have to be the same. Right? Like self-service is table stakes, discovery is table stakes, risk and compliance prevention is table stakes. So I think that harmonization at the data management layer is probably the first place to start thinking about how you are going to get a handle on the fragmentation. Whereas if it's actually, it's at the application layer, as in, let's say there are multiple copies of the data. Let's say there's discrepancies between data where one data set might be more current and the other one might be higher quality. If it's that kind of fragmentation, this is where I think data mesh really shines. Because by trying to identify the owner of the data, this is not an infrastructure problem as much as it'll be like an organizational or a people problem, right? Like you got to understand who really owns this data, knows this data, cares about this data, and making sure that this data set is up to date. So I think that's another way to approach the fragmentation based on where you are coming from. Both of these, mesh and fabric, I think one of the things that's coming out of this conversation is that they're very complementary ways to think about data management, which is fabric, and data monetization, which is mesh, right? And I think that's how I would approach the problem you're describing.
Got it. That's great, Ram. Thanks for clarifying that. And we have another question. Maybe we'll pose this to Interpol, but if Mark or Akshay or Ram, you want to jump in on it as well, we do have about 7 minutes left. This question is from Seishu Matabushi. He's partner over at TC, and he asks, what uses, trends, or tools do you see for the ease of implementation of data fabric? Do you have any examples, for example, that you could provide? Interpol. Oh, I think you might be muted, Interpol.
Is that better?
Yes, got it. Thanks.
Okay. Yeah, no, I was thanking everyone for a great panel, also great questions in the Q&A. So with regard to so there were three dimensions to it, right? There were trends, tools, and uses. Yeah. So and the recording of this session, it was actually a great one for answering that question. I think we touched on all three of those in depth. So I'll just run off a couple of things for those dimensions. So with regard to uses, I mean, the regulatory environment, especially if you're operating globally, pretty much forces you to head down the path of a data fabric, because it's you in many cases you can't even move the data, and in many cases there are different types of restrictions on what you can and cannot do with the data. So I think the regulations are one huge use case for data fabric, and folks touched on some of the others in terms of a trend, which kind of then comes up. It brings one to the use case as well. One major trend that's happened is, I think we're seeing enterprises now wholeheartedly acknowledge that it is going to be a hybrid multi-cloud world that they're going to live in. And obviously the regulatory environment is contributing to that, but I think it's also an better understanding of what you can do to modernize your workflows. And for certain workflows that are extremely critical, certain things make more sense than just the one size fits all. So that's another major use case for the data fabric, in terms of as you try to exist in a hybrid multi-cloud world, you're going to need it. And we learned this because when we acquired Red Hat, OpenShift was really the crown jewel that we were after. And what OpenShift essentially brought us was the fact that you could pretty much run code that you had written once on a public cloud, on-prem, private clouds, etc. So there was it kind of allowed for the portability. But then as we started to work on AI in the enterprise and so forth, we realized that was not enough. The portability by itself was not enough. You actually needed to have a data fabric which gave you kind of the control plane, if you would, in terms of managing all this. Otherwise, the complexity was way too much to expect an enterprise to actually harness. So, so in a sense, that trend of moving towards a hybrid multi-cloud, and also an acknowledgement by all this, kind of the senior technology folks, as well as CEOs by now, that's going to be the reality. That's then led to the other use case. You just, if you try to support that as a technologist or an IT leader, you will find out very quickly that you're going to need that as well. And what was the last one? Tools. So tools, rather than getting into specific tools, I kind of mentioned the major components that make up the data fabric, right? The augmented knowledge graph, the intelligent automation, multimodal types of governance, the self-service marketplace type of capability, the data mesh type of capability, as Mark mentioned here. Those are the key aspects of tools that you need in place. Now, you can try to put them all together, and there are, various possibilities for doing that. I think you need the wherewithal to be able to do that. We've kind of arrived at the conclusion that we want to bring those to a platform type of offerings, which then allows enough flexibility, because everybody's situation is different, so that they're able to then tailor it to apply it. But at the same time, the complexity is taken away, simplified. I wouldn't say taken away. It's going to be complex anyway, which is to move this thing forward. But mainly for the business reasons and the people and process reasons, I think as you take it forward, those will dominate more so than the technology. But it still greatly simplifies the situation.
Sounds like DFAS, maybe Data Fabric as a Service, Interpol. I know there's a whole ecosystem sprouting up that Mark has mentioned before in the past. This is a very exciting time. And I'm excited to announce that we're going back to live face-to-face events with IBM. I'm going to hand it over to Tim to tell you all about that, but it's our first live event in 3 years, 2.5 years. We're really excited about it. We're going to be in New York and San Francisco. I just want to thank you all. This was a fabulous panel. I know our community really needs this information. We got the right after this event, we're going to send you the link to the cloud recordings. You can share it with your colleagues. And I can't thank you enough, gentlemen, and to Priya as well. You did a really great job on this session. And to close up, I'm going to hand it over to Timothy Humphrey. Tim, over to you in North Carolina.
Thanks, Dave. Wow, really, every time we do this, it's a great conversation. I feel like I leave these conversations much smarter, and I hope everyone that attends does too. Look, special thanks to all of our speakers and everyone who took the time to join us today. Don't forget again, another plug for the Data Differentiator Guide. I'm sure you'll find it very insightful. And be sure to register for the next event in our CDO, CTO Summit series on Privacy Expanded. It'll be scheduled for Wednesday, August 17th from noon to 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And as Dave just mentioned, very excited to get back to some in-person events. So we will do our first in-person CDO, CTO Summit since the pandemic started in October. So stay tuned for the details for that. Again, can't wait to see you all there and hope you had a really great time today. Thank you everyone for joining.